September 27, 1941. Richmond, California. The morning fog rolled in from the bay, swallowing the outlines of cranes and half-finished hulls. 1,000 hammers rang out in ragged rhythm, echoing across the shipyard like artillery. Welders sparked beneath the gray sky, bursts of light flashing against sheets of raw steel that still smelled of salt and oil. In the center of it all, Henry Kaiser stood with his hands buried in the pockets of a dusty overcoat. He wasn't a naval officer or a shipwright. He wasn't even trained as an engineer in the traditional sense. He was a builder, a man who had laid highways through the Rockies, dammed the Columbia River, and made concrete move faster than water. And now, with the nation standing on the edge of a global war, he was being asked to do something no one believed was possible: build a fleet of cargo ships faster than the ocean could sink them. The Liberty Ship program was supposed to be the backbone of America's wartime logistics, a floating artery of supplies stretching across the Atlantic to Britain and beyond. But at the current rate, it was a logistical nightmare. Each ship took 230 days to complete. German U-boats were destroying them in weeks. The math was merciless. America was losing ships faster than it could build them. Kaiser's assignment was simple in words, impossible in practice: cut production time by more than 90%. No one had ever done it. The U.S. Maritime Commission had given him the green light only because no one else wanted to try. He walked the length of the Richmond yard, boots splashing in puddles of brine and grease, eyes scanning rows of unassembled hull plates, pipes, and steel beams. The scale was staggering, and yet, to Kaiser, it wasn't chaos. It was opportunity. "Gentlemen," he told his foreman that morning, his voice calm and matter-of-fact, "we're going to build ships like Detroit builds Buicks." The men exchanged doubtful glances. Shipbuilding had always been an art, slow, sequential, dependent on master craftsmen who shaped and riveted steel as if it were oak. But Kaiser saw something different: a process waiting to be industrialized, simplified, divided into tasks that could be done anywhere by anyone. As the fog thinned, sunlight spilled across the skeleton of the first Liberty hull, its steel ribs glinting faintly like the bones of a whale. Kaiser's eyes narrowed. If he could teach America to pour concrete into a dam 1,000 feet high, he could teach them to weld a ship together piece by piece, faster than anyone dared imagine. And so began the most audacious experiment in industrial history. By October 1941, Kaiser had already started tearing up the rulebook. Traditional shipyards built hulls the same way they had for generations, from the keel up, one plate at a time, with every rivet and beam assembled in place. It was slow, exacting, and dependent on small armies of skilled tradesmen. Kaiser looked at the process once, frowned, and said flatly, "That's not how you build for war." Instead, he divided the ship into prefabricated sections: bow, stern, deckhouses, bulkheads, each built simultaneously in separate shops across the yard. The idea came straight from the automobile industry's assembly lines. In Kaiser's version, the shipyard itself became a moving factory. Each shop specialized in a single component, then delivered it by crane or rail to a central slipway where the parts were welded together like a giant steel puzzle. To the old-timers, it looked insane. Ships weren't cars. Their curves, stresses, and weight balances were delicate things. Prefabrication, they warned, would lead to misfits and catastrophic leaks. But Kaiser didn't back down. He began hiring anyone who could hold a torch or turn a wrench: farmhands, high schoolers, women whose husbands had gone to war. "If you can cook a pie," one of his foremen joked, "you can weld a seam." Within months, the Richmond yard became a city unto itself. Cafeterias, nurseries, training schools, and rows of barracks sprang up beside the docks. At night, the place glowed like an industrial sunrise, molten light pouring from foundries, the clang of metal never ceasing. Kaiser introduced 3 full shifts, running 24 hours a day. He brought in conveyor belts, tracked inventories like clockwork, and enforced timing drills so every worker knew how long a weld, a bolt, or a fit should take. The shipyard became a living organism, humming with synchronized motion. When skeptics from Washington visited, they expected to see chaos. What they found instead looked like order on an enormous scale: cranes swinging in rhythm, foremen with clipboards marking progress in chalk, and hundreds of men and women welding with a kind of martial precision. The first prefabricated Liberty ship rose faster than anyone thought possible. What once took 8 months was now measured in weeks. Kaiser's trick wasn't magic. It was organization magnified 1,000-fold. But to him, it still wasn't enough. Standing at the edge of the dock, watching the ship take shape, he said quietly to his engineers, "We can do better." And he meant it. By the spring of 1942, the Richmond shipyards were no longer a gamble. They were a revolution. The first Liberty ships rolled off the line in a fraction of the time old yards required. Each launch drew crowds that filled the waterfront, cheering as the massive gray hulls slid into the bay with a hiss of steam and salt spray. But Kaiser's mind was already elsewhere. He wasn't interested in applause. He was chasing the impossible, a ship built in less than a week. To the engineers around him, it sounded absurd. Shipbuilding, even with prefabrication, demanded alignment, testing, welding, and endless inspections. "If we rush," one warned, "we'll build coffins, not cargo ships." Kaiser only smiled. "Then let's rush smart." He called it production choreography. Instead of waiting for one stage to finish before the next began, every process overlapped. Hull sections were welded while the deckhouses were still being fitted, pipes were installed while paint was drying. Crews were trained to anticipate, not react. A delay in one section meant a ripple of adjustments across dozens of teams. To make it work, Kaiser turned the shipyard into a clockwork system, thousands of moving parts operating in perfect sequence, all measured down to the minute. The experiment came to life in November 1942, when the yard attempted the fastest build in history, the Liberty ship RobertEPeary. At sunrise on November 8th, the keel was laid. Thousands of workers gathered around the slipway, some clutching thermoses, others welding torches. By nightfall, sections of the hull were already locked in place. As floodlights bathed the site in harsh white glow, the noise became thunderous, welders sparking in teams, cranes swinging steel, riveters hammering in cadence. The air was hot with oil and ozone. Reporters called it madness. For 3 days, the yard didn't sleep. Cooks fed workers by the hundreds, children slept in cots beside assembly lines, and the entire city of Richmond seemed to breathe in rhythm with the project. Then, on the 4th day, the impossible happened. On November 12, 1942, the RobertEPeary was launched, built in just 4 days and 15 hours. Thousands cheered as the Liberty ship slid into the Pacific, flags snapping in the cold wind. Some wept openly. Others just stood in silence, realizing they had witnessed the birth of something larger than industry, the moment when human organization outpaced imagination. That day, Henry Kaiser didn't speak to reporters. He simply walked to the end of the dock, stared at the ship floating steady in the bay, and said softly, "Now we know what we can do." After the RobertEPeary's launch, Washington couldn't ignore what had just happened on the California coast. Newspapers across America blared headlines like "4-Day Ship Shocks the Axis" and "Kaiser Turns Time into a Weapon." Henry Kaiser, a man with no naval background, no formal engineering degree, had done what the world's greatest shipyards thought impossible. Within months, his methods spread like wildfire. From Portland to Baltimore, shipyards began adopting Kaiser's assembly line principles, transforming America's coastlines into living factories. Prefabricated sections arrived by rail from hundreds of miles inland, welded together by a workforce that looked nothing like the old shipwright guilds of Europe. By 1943, the Richmond yards alone employed over 90,000 workers, men and women, black and white, farmers and mechanics, immigrants and teenagers. Entire families worked side by side, building the ships that would carry tanks, planes, and ammunition to every front. And these weren't just ships, they were lifelines. Liberty ships carried 10,000 tons of cargo each, food for Britain, fuel for Africa, bombs for the Pacific. Every one that made it through the U-boat gauntlet meant another Allied offensive could continue, another convoy could survive. President Roosevelt himself called them the ugly ducklings that won the war. And behind every one of those steel hulls was Kaiser's quiet genius, a civilian who understood that the war would be won not only by bullets and bombs, but by efficiency and willpower. But Henry Kaiser didn't stop there. When he saw his workers collapsing from exhaustion or illness, he built hospitals, the first modern company-sponsored health plans in the United States. A healthy worker, he said, is a faster builder. His healthcare model would later evolve into Kaiser Permanente, one of America's largest medical networks. By the war's end, Kaiser's shipyards had launched 1,490 Liberty ships, nearly a third of the total built worldwide. What began as a desperate gamble became the industrial backbone of the Allied victory. In the cold dawn of 1945, as the last Liberty ships slipped across the Pacific toward Okinawa, Henry Kaiser stood again at Richmond's Pier 3. Around him, cranes were still moving, torches still burning, even as the war's end drew near. He watched one final launch, a Liberty ship disappearing into the gray horizon, and smiled faintly. "For days," he whispered. "That's all it takes when everyone believes it can be done." The Liberty fleet sailed on, slow, heavy, and unstoppable, a moving testament to one man's refusal to accept the limits of time.